Welcome back to the podcast, Stanford. Now, before I forget, you probably all know that Stanford herded a merry bunch of poets together last year and created a cat anthology, Window Seats, a contemporary anthology of cat haiku and centenary, available on Stanford's website, Bottle Rockets Press. Details in the show notes.
And I'm going to be doing, as you know, we'll talk about later, a bird anthology, which will be a second in the series. And the cat anthology kind of acts as a model or a sample for the future anthologies. It gives you the feel for what I'm looking for and the different approaches.
Well, let's mention it now before we forget. It's a bird anthology. You're looking for submissions. Where can people find the details if they didn't get my mailing?
Right now it's on my Twitter account, which is Haiku with a Bang. It's going to be very competitive like the other one.
Yeah.
In other words, so if I have one poem about, let's say, a bird, I don't know, with wet feet jumping on a veranda, like I think it was Shiki's poem, and I get 100 of those, I'm only going to pick the best one of the 100. I don't need 99 other versions. So that's the problem is, so I ask people to really think and go deep into think of things that have not been covered about birds. And I'm not looking for ornithology. So it's more on a more wide-reaching level where you don't have to know anything about birds, but the bird aspect, like the cat aspect, acted as a literary vehicle to discuss things, different things in our human condition.
Yeah. And I know you have very specific criteria, and I would urge people to read them because you just make it really easy to reject things if you haven't followed the guidelines.
When people really read them, it's very basic. It's guidelines that have been around for 20, 30 years that I've taken from other standard journals. It's right-hand corner, name, typed, nothing on toilet paper or crayons. I just ask people to be as professional as they would like to be treated. That just saves me a lot of time so I could focus on the poetry instead of cleaning up people's submissions. I'm looking for exceptional poems.
Good.
Yeah, I hope it to be around for a while, this anthology too.
Yeah. Well, I'm working on mine. And
it really isn't a lot of pressure. Basically, is just filling, just going basic standard with that, with the guidelines. That's,
Well, we're here to celebrate Kerouac today. And I'm so pleased you could do it, not just because you're one of the world's foremost experts on Kerouac and his haiku, or should I say haikus, but you also understand the Zen of his work, which I have a problem with because, if anything, I am the absolute opposite of Zen. And Stanford, I was reading a book of poetry today by Wendy Cope, and it's called Anecdotal Evidence. And I came across a poem which is called At 70. And I'd like to read you a bit because it sort of sums me up and gives you an idea of the problem you've got in teaching me about Kerouac and Zen. This is a verse from At 70. It might be better for my health if I were less dogmatical and didn't freak out when a news report is ungrammatical, or when a word is mispronounced. If someone says mischievous, I want to shake them and explain it doesn't rhyme with devious. I don't know if you know Gilbert and Sullivan, but it's meant to be said at the sort of the rhythm of Gilbert and Sullivan's Major General from Pirates of Penzance. And I definitely didn't do it justice. So I'll put a link in the show notes so people can do it themselves. But I thought, not only does it give you an idea of the problem you've got with me, but it speaks of rhythm and musicality in poetry. And I think some of that is what you're going to tell us about today.
Yes, and the interesting thing is that many American fans, readers of Jack Kerouac really don't know, really don't appreciate. I mean, I think a lot of them just don't know that he was writing a lot of poetry. He was always writing a lot of poetry, and his poetry is excellent. It still holds up. There's parts of his other, I've read everything, he's pretty much written that's been published. And some of the novels just have some issues nowadays that, wouldn't be PC or whatever. But you have to remember too, he was writing to be edgy at that time. He was very edgy in the, that we're talking in the 50s or the 40s. He was writing on the, on the road. And then the Hype Dharma Bums was 58, I believe, or 57. So, he had that aspect to him that, edge. But it was interesting because the most important thing with Kerouac with the Dharma bums, which really was the impetus to spread haiku in the United States. And that book just took off. And what it did is it created what they called the Backpack Nation, and to hit the road more than even on the road, I think, and write poetry. And it really was a very major book for poets in the United States. It can't be understated. I mean, it's understated all the time. And it also kind of gives you an idea how he started haiku and what his lessons were, what he learned. And he really took it to a brilliant level. Because the interesting thing, and I want keep talking about the Dharma bums, it's a very important book because it's the book that again spread American haiku, 9575 haiku, may I add. Kerouac did not write any 575. And the issue, the major theme, which if people don't know Buddhism, kind of miss this in Dharma bums, is we have Gary Snyder as the protagonist. We have Kerouac as the hero too. And Gary Snyder is Zen, very Zen. And he is very chop, chop, chop. Because Zen, if you've ever gone to a Zen retreat, the sitting meditation Zazen, a lot of it is very structured. It's extremely, extremely structured. So you have Gary Snyder throughout the whole book telling Kerouac how to follow Zen and the structure. And that was not Kerouac's MO. His MO was more loosey-goosey, freewheeling guy. And he described his own Buddhism, Kerouac, as being neutral. So he wasn't at that time when Dharma bums, he wrote Dharma bums, he says, when I was a Dharma bum, he already had passed Buddhism by, that stage had passed by the time the book came out. But the thing is that it's interesting what you talk about Zen, because Snyder's very Zen throughout the whole thing, consistently. And Snyder left the United States to go to Japan. So Snyder lived the Zen life. Kerouac didn't. And in Dharma bums, the beginning part where Snyder makes it up the mountain and Kerouac doesn't, Kerouac creates a human hero that doesn't always succeed, that fails. And I think the beauty that is in jeopardy, because people have been trying to whitewash Kerouac, is that Kerouac had tons of problems, issues with mental issues and substance issues. But to me, that's what makes him such a fantastic writer, because he wrote incredible stuff with all these obstacles. Jujubes on Zen Manual, my knees are cold. Prayer beads on the holy book, my knees are cold. In Regina Weinreich's book, all his haiku are there. So this is a perfect example of different versions of the same haiku. And you could see the one on the right, Jujubes on Zen Manual, my knees are cold. So that's more of obviously a Buddhist oriented haiku. But the thing, and of course the season word would be an implied season word of cold. So, but the other thing is, as we know from Zen sitting, Zen is really hard on your knees. And so is Catholicism. That's why I'm not a Catholic, I guess. Is hard on your knees. And so what I think he does here, he has, this could be a Buddhist version or more of a Christian version of the same poem. Prayer beads on the holy book, my knees are cold. The prayer beads are what we would call mala beads. And, Christians have the rosary, Buddhists have mala beads to do, Tibetans especially do a lot of meditation with mala beads, more than I think the Zen. I could be wrong, but I think so. If I had to choose between the two, I like the prayer beads one, I think is more universal, but we can't deny that he's experimenting, he's dipping into Zen, even though he's not, he's taken the good parts of Zen, he's cherry picked. So even though he's a neutral Buddhist, he has understood Zen. This is a perfect example between the Catholicism maybe and the Buddhism. same basic idea that in the end, the poem is the same idea. The essence is the same, not the religion, but the poem.
He does a lot of thinking about that, having been brought up Catholic himself.
Yes,
Yeah,
very
he makes
Catholic.
he makes those comparisons all the time with his work, doesn't he? So you'll find other examples probably where it's more Buddhist, and another where he would sort of refer back to the Christianity side of things.
And that was interesting because Tibetan Buddhism is very much like Catholicism and all the mysticism and the this and the that, where Zen is very stripped down. Like, Zen is like you're walking around in a loincloth. The Tibetan Buddhism is much more ritualistic. I mean, Zen has its rituals too, but more ritualistic and stuff. So he could go up in between both, but the essence of the poem, no matter what religion it is the same. And the knees are cold. This is like the trying to become enlightened. And that's the challenge, the spiritual challenges. And he never writes that he's, as far as I know, he never writes that he's enlightened.
Yeah. And I wondered also if there are other examples that you're going to talk about as well, whether he's slightly mocking himself too in his struggle and his potential failing. To me, as a person who knows very little, so you can put me back in my box, but it strikes me that he's doing his best, he's praying, he's meditating, but his knees are cold and that distracts him, and he's sort of mocking himself for that distraction too.
I tell you, the one thing that Zen Buddhism does, I don't care who you are, it takes a toll on your kneecaps. That is part of it, because you're supposed to control in Zen. You're supposed to, be rational about it. You're supposed to see the suffering or the pain and let it go. So it's basically almost like the idea of the crucifixion. Mm-hmm. Crucifixion, if he didn't suffer, would it have not been worth it?
Yeah.
That's the beauty of these poems, is they could be read both ways. And there's a new Kerouac museum about to open up, which is very interesting, in Lowell. Okay. And they're making it using an old church, Catholic church. This was just announced in Lowell. That was Kerouac's church. I think if you're putting a poet in a church, which was once a church, we're leaning towards the Catholicism aspect. So Gary Snyder said to him when he first met Kerouac, he goes, "When you die, you'll be given the last rites. You won't die as a Buddhist. You'll die as a Christian."
Hot coffee and a cigarette. Why Zazen?
This is one of my favorite Kerouac haikus. Well, it's not a haiku because there's no, as far as I know, coffee's not a season word. I could be wrong. Tell me if I'm wrong. Cigarettes are not a season word, as far as I know, nor is Zazen. But this is the perfect example of the beat. Okay, so remember, we're taking post-World War II, and the beats were known for, which was wonderful, is they were taking other people's cultures and admiring them and trying to take American poetry, or the poetry what they had, international poetry, and take it to another place. And this is the perfect example of Kerouac's basically juxtaposing with Snyder. Snyder was like, chop, chop, chop. Zen, you have to sit Zazen. Some Zen practitioners sit for days straight. So, if you've ever been a smoker, the idea of smoking a cigarette just gives you that moment of relaxation. You could kind of like tune out the world. So this is kind of, to me, almost like the beat idea of Zazen. He says, why Zazen? This is like the beat idea of meditation. All you need is a cup of coffee and a cigarette.
I hadn't quite seen that before, so I'm really pleased you pointed that out. It's probably obvious, but also when I read this, I think he had a problem with authority.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And to me also, what I read into this was hot coffee and a cigarette, why Zazen, sort of, again, looking at what I perceive his relationship with Snyder to have been like.
Yes.
Through the writing, sort of a butting of heads between the two of them.
Well, again, it's the idea of mandatory ritual to please God or the church or whatever, compared to a freewheeling manner of connecting with God or a spiritual thought.
Yeah.
So again, it's the neutralness. And again, if it's in your heart, this is what the side Kerouac really took. It doesn't matter if you did so many bows, or you did so many of this, or you did so many of that. And I just think of something too, going back to the last one for 1 second, is with his knees, Kerouac had phlebitis, and he had very bad leg problems. And you always hear about Kerouac standing on his head. Like he would go to places, and it's in the books. It wasn't that he was doing it for fun. He was doing it to relieve the pressure of the blood flowing in his legs. So he probably even had an extra hard time sitting. And I know this from personal experience, seeing people at Zen monasteries, doing the zazen.
Yeah.
He might not have been able to, sustain it, but it's from the heart. That's what he's pushing. It's not the ritual. It's from the heart. It's what you feel. The sound of silence is all the instruction you'll get. This one is a very, very Zen style haiku. And what's is it a haiku? Is the centenary? I don't really care as long as it's good. That's my own personal feeling. I point out things, but the interesting thing about this is one must know that Kerouac loved slapstick. He absolutely loved slapstick. He has a very long poem recorded about the Three Stooges. Okay. And I think what he was able to do was connect the Zen literature of old with the slapstick. And because Zen literature had a lot of slapstick in it. If you read Korean, Chinese, Japanese Zen literature, you hear the stories like the disciple would say, "Master, what is the meaning of life?" The master would say, "Look down at your feet." The disciple would look down at his feet, and the master would kick him down the stairs or down a mountain or something like that. And that was just, so that Zen, what happens is, the idea is to jolt you into enlightenment. I mean, that's one. Buddha said, I think there's 84,000 paths to enlightenment, but that is one, and this is one that the Zen people try to do. So Kerouac really plays the Buddhist ascetic, not aesthetic, but the Buddhist ascetic with the aesthetics, and the Zen aesthetic. You're on your own. The sound of silence is all, it's like, that's all you need. And that's very Zen, that's very haiku. And that's, this is all the instruction you'll get, and you have to figure it out. That is so standard Zen. That's what haiku is about in general. We have a big fight in the United States sometimes, about haiku and Zen, and it's like, haiku is not Zen, Zen is not haiku. But it is impossible to deny, and I will go on the book saying this, that haiku definitely has Zen DNA, has Taoist DNA, Shinto DNA. It's what was around at the time. And I think that's really important, because Kerouac really said haiku is seeing. It's not looking, it's seeing. And the seeing doesn't have to be always visual, because as we know with Kerouac, with his jazz, which we'll get into, seeing is also hearing, smelling. It's using all the senses. So I love this, and it has his humor to it too, which he's not a Zen practitioner, but he tried it. He lapses on to the Zen ideas, and he really knows how to really master it. He really does.
Next one.
Yep.
Okay.
This one, so Kerouac could write in many different styles, which is fantastic. It's like he's switching on and off. And this one is, in my medicine cabinet, the winter fly has died of old age. So we know it's winter. A quick rundown: medicine cabinet. What does a medicine cabinet have in front of it? A mirror. We know it's winter. He is going to the medicine cabinet. Why is he going to the medicine cabinet? Because there's something in there that he would like to take for whatever reason. And it's probably empty. And what does he see? He sees a foretelling. The winter fly has died of old age. So he's basically, the whole idea in Zen is seeing yourself as you are, the truth, no tinted glasses, as it is. And he's forced, before he opens that medicine cabinet, to look at himself in the mirror. So it's brilliant. And you have the sound and how he read it. In my medicine cabinet, the winter fly has died of old age. So it's interesting again that he's using caps here very much like Blythe, because that's where he learned haiku from, was the 4 volumes of Blythe. In the Dharma Bums, it's mentioned in Gary Snyder's house. Now, Blythe lived in Japan next to, he was friends with D.T. Suzuki, who was a very strict Zen guy, who lived in a monastery. And Blythe in Japan, if you go to see Blythe's grave in Japan, he's buried back to D.T. Suzuki. So Blythe, some people have issues with Blythe, and to me, Blythe is my god, because he was very Zen. And he was. But so those 4 volumes really is what kind of took to the literary community away from 575, because not a single poem. Now, to me, my argument about 575 is, if the tutor to the emperor son of Japan didn't do haiku in 575, I would prefer to side with the tutor of the emperor of Japan than the other way. I mean, he understood language, because Blythe was a Brit, and then he moved to Korea, and then he moved to Japan. There's a new book coming out in a few months about his letters and his life, which in English, which is finally, it's long overdue. So this is it's a very melodic. Kerouac uses tone, intonation, all these things that he took from jazz, from the beat vernacular, which in Japan and China, as I believe, that a lot of poetry, most poetry was meant to be recited. And we lose that in the United States. A big thing I do in all my workshops, and I do it to myself, and people probably think here's a homeless guy walking down the street talking to himself, is I read my stuff out loud all the time. All the time. I do workshops and make people read their stuff, because then you're hitting another sense.
Yeah.
Haiku should have hearing, smell, taste, touch, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we want to look at today is yes, read your poems out loud. That's so important. I mean, that goes to the heart of a podcast, obviously, but also think about your listener or your reader, and how is that sound affecting them? Yes. What are they feeling?
Yeah, because haiku is so difficult to read, to recite, because it's so short.
Yeah.
So you really need to capture the audience and mix it up in a way. Like I've read before, and I try not to have any monotony with the way I read. I mean, you want to put the audience into a zone, but you also don't want everything to meld. If you're changing the tone, and you see that, the beautiful thing about Kerouac's haiku is you could go online to YouTube and type in American haikus Kerouac, and you could hear him read from that album. Is he mixes it up. He does a lot of techniques that are used in jazz: tone, quickness, intonation, bead, meter, all this stuff that you hear in a jazz, and sounds. Kerouac loved sounds. A lot of poets will try to avoid a word that's very difficult to pronounce. Kerouac looked for those words. He loved to use those words. He did a lot with like Hawaiian words and other words, or even like Buddhist words like Tathagata, which is a honorary name for the Buddha. And he loved using those syllables. And if he was going to use the syllables, he was going to make sure that they hit you in a certain way. In my medicine cabinet, the winter fly has died of old age.
The one thing I want to mention as well on this one, that it struck me in this one, is the idea of love and compassion for all things, regarding human and non-human things. And I think that comes through in this poem as well. Next one.
Wine at dawn, the long rainy sleep. If you read about wine, you look at the classical Chinese poets, the old story is that they would have some people on the top of a river, and they would send sake down in cups, or wine in teacups down the river, and you had to create a verse or write a poem before the cup passed you. So if you were able to write the verse, you got to drink. So alcohol drinking is very, and especially even for Buddhists there, is very common in poetry. It's a common theme. It's part of the poetry experience. But this really kind of shows where he's hurting, because like even in this gallery 6 reading early on, and you could see it, Kerouac didn't read at the 6th gallery reading. He was going around asking people for money to buy wine, jugs of wine to pass around to people.
Yes.
So, and he does admit in many different ways he has a problem, and he hates himself for it, because he always looks, it's the same thing that Santoka did. Santoka was a spiritual person like Kerouac, and they both wanted to reach this level, the spiritual or religious level, and they were bound by having human bodies and dealing with the obstacles that the human condition deals with on a daily basis. So this is a different tone. Wine at dawn, the long rainy sleep. The idea of the long rainy sleep, it's kind of being parallel to the drunkenness and always being in that alcoholic haze. And it's a poem of longing. It's a poem of wishing you were trying to live by the ideals. And so this is, I think, a very personal poem, and it's not one you see that often. And that's why some of these poems you see all the time, and some of them you don't. And that's why the thing is, reading this book to prep for this podcast, the book of haikus, I'm telling you, if I had to take 5 books to a desert island, this is one of them. Kerouac, you could read him on his sleeves. He showed himself on his sleeves. And this is a perfect example of that.
Coming at it from a Catholic point of view, when I read this one, I felt a huge amount of emptiness. I felt that he was feeling very angry with himself. He was feeling very empty as a person, because there's all that Catholic guilt, if you like, about the wine at dawn, and then the long rainy sleep.
I found my cat, one silent star. I love this poem because it's for all of us. We don't need to hit people over the head with haiku. Sometimes it's something this short, this small, and haiku, that's all you need. Instead of all this wordiness, or it's like trying to hit somebody over the head. Sometimes you can make a better impression, like example Santoka with a few words. He had some haiku, 5 words, and this, I found my cat, one silent star. And you could just picture him going outside looking for his cat. His cat either got out, or was trying to bring his cat in. And of course, a lot of times cats are very quiet unless it's time for dinner. But they are very quiet. And the beauty of it is, like, he's out there and he's like, he has to go out to rescue the cat or find the cat. But then he has that zenness of notices the one silent star above him. And then that makes him contemplate. As in the same as thing, the cat is by itself and the star is by itself too. So there's a relationship. But I think what a lot of Zen and what a haiku does is that when we go out, we don't write haiku, we harvest haiku. We see and what comes into us. And the idea of what makes haiku work is what Blythe said and what Henderson said was, a moment of
it's not enlightenment, is it? But it's something similar to that.
And capturing it, and it's like basically connecting. I'm sorry, I can't think of the word in English now, even though it's my native language.
Don't worry, that's my life.
But it's like the idea is, in Buddhism, it talks about being hit with a dart. The dart doesn't hurt you. The thinking of being hit with a dart is what affects you. So the actual thing. So one thing leads to another, and it leads, something is ordinary, daily ordinary, can be something enlightening. And that's the beauty of this poem. It's just, and it doesn't need more. I found my cat, one silent star.
And to me, it's genius because the juxtaposition puts you exactly where he is. As you said, he's looking for his cat, and because the stars are out, it's evening or nighttime, but one silent star to me. And how many times do we all go out early evening, early nightfall, and you see that very first star in the sky, don't you? And you can ponder the immensity of the
yes,
universe that we live in.
but another thing to take it to another within that is, okay, so we know as being a haiku readers, it's nighttime.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, he is looking in the dark.
Yeah.
He's searching in darkness. And, you know, the cat is that metaphor for, you know, spirituality or enlightenment,
Yes.
or whatever.
Oh, yes.
He's in the dark, probably on his knees, looking for the cat in the bushes or whatever. And the sign of hope is that one silent star. It's not an astro. I mean, it's not a meteor. It's not a comet. It's nothing flashy.
Mm-hmm.
It's just one silent star. But that's in Zen. That's all the ascetic principle of Zen. That's all you need. You don't need more.
Yeah.
And that's and it's such a different style than in my medicine cabinet.
Mm.
He's looking for something in darkness.
Yeah.
And you know, the cat does represent, in one sense, maybe that star too, when the cat's inside, you know. So that's one reason why he's put all his love and affection, which he really did, in his cats, you know. Okay, so this one I love this one because this is total beat. Has the total jazz feel, has the total performance feel. But you see, the thing is, I think my own personal opinion, and people will be shooting arrows at me now, is you could perform a poem, but if the poem isn't good and could stand by itself, it doesn't stand up. Yep. This stands up both ways. But he would do, "B, why are you staring at me? I'm not a flower." And that's how he did it, you know. So he's giving it the attitude. He's also talking very much in the way that Isa would talk to a flea, because Isa was Pure Land Buddhism. And Pure Land Buddhism, there's less of a hierarchy of God, semi-God, demigod, humans, and then you go to the, I think, animal realm, the hungry ghost realm, and the hell realm. So Pure Land Buddhists look as everything like Taoists is the same way as like Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve didn't know they were human until they bit the apple, one of them ate the apple, and then they realized they were naked. Mm-hmm. So that's the same idea in Taoism, is that we were part of nature, like what Thoreau and Emerson would say. We're not separate from nature. And by Kerouac talking to the bee, he's not personifying the bee in that sense. He's considering the bee an equal being as him and the flower. He's not a flower. I mean, it goes both ways, but that's what I think the beauty is. It's very bee, and it's like, "Bee, why are you staring at me? I'm not a flower," you know? It shows the jazz, it shows all the different things that he could combine and make it work both ways.
When you read it out loud, when you perform this poem, because it is a performance poem, it makes a huge difference to just reading it on the page, doesn't it?
Yes, and that's the thing, especially with like this next one too, is hearing him compared to, reading him is always interesting, because I expect when I was reading him, his intonations really come through, maybe because I had heard him before. That's not with other poets. This poem is probably one of my favorite poems of all time. And it's not one of his most, he reads it, so he really liked it too, because I forgot how many poems he read on that recording. He did the jazz session with Zoot Sims and Al Cohn, two saxophone players. And he weaves in and out of the two saxophones. But it's Nightfall Boy smashing dandelions with a stick. Now, this is something that a little boy would do.
Oh, yeah.
You do it all the time. Little girl too, maybe.
Yeah.
You see them at football games, soccer games, and a kid's like bored, or like walking around the place, or like you're going home from dinner, from playing outside at night. And here's the beauty of this too: is season word dandelions.
Yep.
We deal with the moment is nightfall. It's getting dark, and the dandelion is yellow. Each flower, in a sense, is almost like a sun. And the nightfall is happening because he's hitting all the suns out. He's knocking all the suns off their stem. knocking the sun out of the sky, and with a stick as he's walking by. So I
Putting
mean,
the lights out.
yeah, putting the lights out. So
No, I love this one. It's one I wish I'd written myself.
yeah,
You know.
and the thing is, what Kerouac can do, which a lot of people cannot no longer do, and this is the Zen aspect that Kerouac did embrace, was Zen mind, beginner's mind. And Zen, you need a childlike mind
Yeah.
to write these to that level. It's like to write to the peak level, you have to have a child mind. When you have that child's mind, you're in the moment. You're not thinking in the past. You're not thinking in the future. It's like capturing that moment, freezing it. And this is what, and by using a child, it's even more enhanced, that idea. Now, this one too is very interesting because, like in the book, again, Regina Reinreich takes all of the different versions of the poems and shows it to us, and she makes this book work. It really works. So you have two here. This is another one that he read in that recording with Zoot Sims and Al Cohn, and I believe the one he read was the first one. Glowworm sleeping on this flower. Your light's on. Glowworm sleeping on this flower. Your light's on. And then you have another version. Glowworms brightly sleeping on my flowers. But I think the one he probably preferred, at least for performance, would have been the first one.
Yeah.
What does a glowworm represent? Enlightenment. Glowworm sleeping on this flower. Your light's on. So it's a play, it's a joke too. It's like, hey, it's almost like your headlights are on in your car, but it's also an admiration too, because you have light, and the light is not hot. It's spiritual light that doesn't have to be hot, and it's again that when he's talking about stuff like that, he is part of nature. He's trying to, like Isa, like about the fleas jumping on his bed, it's like kind of like trying to help out the glowworm. Glowworm is sleeping, on this flower, your lights on. And on this flower, as remember when Buddha gave his first talk, the Deer Park talk, he held up a flower when someone asked him what the meaning of life was. And his answer was holding up a flower. So the idea of one flower, or a flower in Buddhist terms too, is it's not just the flower, it's the sun, it's the rain, it's the soil, it's the decay, it's everything, it's the sky, it's the heavens, it's all the things that made this flower to this day.
Yeah,
and
the universal.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the seed, it's the water, it's not, and that's in Buddhism, everything is interconnected. So he's really kind of coming at these poems with that Buddhist and Taoist sensibilities.
Yeah.
Looking at this now, it's glowworms brightly sleeping on glowworms. One is a glowworm.
Yeah.
So it's more immediate. To me, it's like when you start generalizing, you start losing the essence of any poem. The more you zoom in, the more you feel the heart, the taste, again, that essence, the chi of that poem. The more you go out and generalize or using multiple things, a lot of times you do not. And the second one, the glowworms brightly sleeping on my flowers, not on this flower, this glowworm.
Last one, I think, or last two, I think.
Last two. Tuesday, one more drop of rain from my roof. It's this wabi-sabi, again, it's the living as an aesthetic, not aesthetic. It's like I had a poem that was something like, all day rain, they told me this cabin had a roof. All day rain, they told me this cabin had a roof. I think this next poem is in the top 5 best poems ever written in English. And it's funny because it's never been, as far as I've seen, when they have anthologies of haiku beats or haiku poetry with beats, this is not included in that. It's in the backcountry, which I love. So Snyder writes, after weeks of watching the roof leak, I fixed it tonight by moving a single board. Brilliant. So this is a theme that we see Kerouac sharing with Snyder. Tuesday, one more drop of rain from my roof. So it's like, maybe the roof is leaking, and it's interesting, he said Tuesday compared to what other day. I'm not sure. One more drop of rain. Tuesday is the beginning of the week. It's not the beginning of the week, but it's earlier in the week.
Mhm.
One more drop of rain. So maybe we wonder what's going on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday.
Yeah. Or even what was wrong with fixing it over the weekend. But anyway,
Yeah.
yes,
Well, the
yeah,
weekend he was probably having a party.
this is true.
I'm serious, and then he,
This
then
is true.
it, everything is over and he's sitting home. And maybe that's another thing too. Maybe that's why the Tuesday is there. It's the idea of anticlimax.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
good
like,
point.
it's like after Christmas, the big lead up to Christmas or whatever holiday with all the presents, the this and that, and then the big downer of it's over and now I'm by myself. The
Yeah.
company is gone.
Now you mention it, it's got that that feeling of internal emptiness again.
Yeah.
Um,
From my roof, too. So it's like, which is him, which is his chi, his psyche, which
Yeah.
himself. The roof is just kind of a metaphor
Yes.
for himself in a sense.
Yeah. But I'm with you. I'm with you on the Gary Snyder one. It's a cracking poem.
Yeah.
Do you want to read it one last time?
Yeah, I've never heard this one. After weeks of watching the roof leak, I fixed it tonight by moving a single board. And that's a very traditional theme for both of these guys.
Mhm.
Snyder lived in a little hut-like house,
Yeah.
and he was doing Firewatch stuff too. That's how he got Kerouac involved. So, I mean, he had spent his time living in these little places, and that's what he wanted. He was very much an ascetic. That's the whole idea too with haiku. You think about the backpack movement was married with haiku. You don't need a lot to write haiku. I mean, you need a notebook and a pen.
How do we write like Jack? So we were looking at the things we've looked at so far, I guess, are he was a great one for traveling, whether in the United States or his merchant marine career, but he also traveled. He was a fluent French speaker, so I know he was in France. He's
Yes.
been to Morocco, also French speaking, I guess.
His actually first writings were in French because he grew
Yes.
up with a French Canadian family, and his first writings, he was originally plugged as Jean-Louis Kerouac in the United States, and then that didn't last too long, and then he switched to Jack Kerouac when I don't know if it was before his first book, Town and Country, or maybe it was even before that. But yeah, so he did speak French, and there was that funny, like right towards the end of his life, he did a TV show in Canada, and he's just going off in French. French was his first language.
And I think maybe that, going back to something you said previously about him not being afraid to use foreign words in his poetry, comes from the fact that he's a native French speaker, brought up in an English speaking world. So, he's got that play on languages. He's not scared of languages.
Yeah, and Lowell was it was a mill town.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it was like the typical industrial revolution, American version of industrial revolution, mill town, and there was a lot of ethnic groups there too. So also, as I say, his travels are not just physical travels, but traveling through different religions, traveling through different thoughts, different philosophies, which I think is almost might be an American invention. When I read Japanese poems, I can't think of any ideas where like traditional Japanese poets were exploring spirituality outside their realm, without their circles. And Americans, this whole thing of World War II and kind of seeing the desolation that was left by the war and looking for new ideas, looking at society and saying, guess what? Society doesn't work. And you want me to follow in this path that doesn't work? That's crazy. And I think that's what the whole beat idea was about, to kind of explore. And so that's where religion, philosophy, and these guys, they knew their literature. They, Kerouac, again, he really he knew his Buddhism. He knew inside and out all the terms. And I really think that's because of the Catholicism. He knew all the technical terms. And, he knew the Zen terms too. But I think his poetry leaned on the Zen side, but his practices leaned more, more of a neutral Zen.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've highlighted the ideas that I came across, or that were highlighted for me in his sort of travels through religion. I mean, we've already talked about the sort of the comparison between his Catholicism and Buddhism, but what comes out of his poetry to me also, the sort of compassion and mercy and love, and this state of nothingness, this emptiness, the mu, if you like. I mean, you've also spoken about the way he works with natural phenomenon. That was clear in the poetry that came through, and he, as you said, philosophical thoughts on the human condition and impermanence.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing of in Buddhism, the first noble truth there is suffering.
Yeah.
So a lot of it too was he wrote about trying to be on the path, and his sharing and confessing, in a sense, that, like we all have, it's a rocky road, and there are challenges, and we can't. And the lesson we maybe should learn is we can't beat ourselves up. We're always a work in progress, and we can't beat ourselves up for something that we want to be, which might be spiritual or holy, but they're spiritual and holy, and we're human, so we're not playing in a tilted. We're playing in a tilted playing field. It's not fair,
Nope, quite right. And then other things that you came out of, I mean, you were clear. Forget 575. I mean, there's nothing wrong with 575 if you can make it work, but so often in the English language, it doesn't really work.
And he adapted haiku to the English language. Again, if you happen to write a 575 haiku without counting syllables and trying, and it comes out naturally, God bless you. But it's vernacular too. He was one of the first Americans to use more of a colloquial, vernacular, it's kind of redundant, but when Blythe's poems, remember, he was most of those books were classical haiku poets who talked in a more formal literary style. Our thing would be like reading Shakespeare, I guess, would be the example. So he took haiku, and the idea of the beats too was to make it more accessible for everyone. It wasn't the guys wearing bow ties. It was the guys. Kerouac didn't want to be on the mountain all the time. He wanted to live in the valley, and that's where everyone else was, in the valley.
So yes, simple, ordinary, everyday language is great. Write it as you'd speak it. Don't go for the literary. Don't head to Shakespeare.
Yeah, and he wanted you to focus on the words. We don't chew the words. We pass over. That's the difference between a lot of Western style poetry, where the poetry comes at you. Haiku, we have to participate. The poet writes the first part of the circle, we finish the second part. We finish the circle, but we are participating in that.
Yeah.
And that's why he wanted to have it simple language, that there would be no barriers. And again, if the essence of the poem, the meaning of the poem is right and like worthy, then it doesn't need fancy language.
Yeah.
We don't need to dress it up. It takes away from it.
I mean, you said it already. When you're looking at the words, think of the sounds in each syllable, and think how your reader will interpret those sounds and interpret the words and how they react to them. But that's it, I think. Okay. Thank you very much, Stanford M Forrester, for coming along and helping us out today.
It's been wonderful.
It was great. Thank you very much. I do enjoy working with you. You always make me smile. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's always wonderful to be here.
I look forward to reading your haikus that you're going to send to us as a result of this presentation. Don't forget, much like with Stanford's Bird Anthology, do go and read our submission guidelines and criteria. And Stanford, I'm looking forward already to our next workshop. So we've already have something sort of planned for either later this year or next year. So don't worry, Stanford will be back.
Thank you again. It's been absolutely a pleasure.
Cheers. Thank you.